Hello all, my name is Helena Valente. I'm from Eleflow, which is a Brazilian data services company established in 2016. We work on the entire data lifecycle and we help our clients attain better outcomes on their AI initiatives. Today, I'm really excited to introduce a good friend of mine, Steve Hoskin, who has lots of years of experience on the financial market, a financial industry, and he's going to talk to us about governance on the AI era. Steve?
Good morning, Elena.
Good morning. So we can start. I'll see you guys after the presentation.
All right. So I'm going to talk about data governance in the AI era. There's been lots of changes in our industry recently. And as we think about how we want to manage and govern data, I think we need to examine why we're doing governance and how we can do it differently. So first, let's start by talking about what is data governance. So data governance is a set of principles and practices. And the purpose that we're looking for through those principles and practices is more effective running of our business through timely, accurate, consistent, and comprehensive data. Now, those outcomes are achieved through a combination of people, process, and technology. And I think it's really important to stress that it's a combination. It's not, silos of efforts. This is a team effort to get this done properly. And when we do it right, it makes the data easier to find, easier to understand, and to use. And it removes redundancies in the data. It helps increase the trust in the data. It enables effective ownership and sharing. And finally, it ensures compliance with data privacy and other regulatory needs. And I just want to point out that only the last one is about rules and regulations. The others are really about enabling the use of data and being more effective to get better business outcomes. Okay, so what data governance is not is it's not a set of constraints to slow down the creation and use of data. It's not a set of manual processes that are handled by some separate data team or data governance team. And it's not at odds with the needs of growing the business. Often in banking, we talk about growing and protecting the business. It's not at odds with growing the business because it's helping enable the use of data. And finally, it's not a one-time activity. This is something that as you mature in your use of data, data governance continues to be important and continues to reap benefits of doing good data governance. So with AI, why would data governance matter? Don't these models take the data and just do some magic on it? Why do I even need to care about data governance? And so recently, James Spector from OpenAI, he made a statement on social media that what he found was training of data sets long enough with different models, different weights and trainings eventually converge to the same point. And he found that the model behavior isn't as much determined by the architecture, the hyperparameters, the optimization choices. It's determined by your data set and nothing else. I think it's a little bit of hyperbole to say that nothing else matters but the data. But what he was trying to say is data is probably the biggest driver in our models and how we get the right outcomes. And so, and that's why data governance and how we get the right data really matters in terms of getting to the right outcomes. And so because data matters so much, the AI vendors put a lot of effort into curation of their data sets. And that curation really follows a lot of the practices and principles that we talk about with data governance and data management. Now, when we're trying to take those models and extend them with companies' data to allow for that company to add their competitive value with their own data sets. It's really important that we put the same effort into curating our data sets as the AI tooling companies do with creating their models in the first place. And so as we use these tools like Azure AI Studio, Databricks Mosaic AI, and all the others, we're feeding in our company's data into those tools to extend the models. And once we get those models, one of the biggest causes of problems with those models that creates these AI hallucinations is bad data. And so we need to make sure that our company's data that's being fed into those models is the best possible data. How do we do that? Through data management and data governance. And so that's going to benefit not just our AI models, but we're also feeding that same data to operational use cases, to analytical use cases, to our BI reporting, and so on. And so building these data products in the first place that have good data and using data management and data governance principles will help us to feed the best data to all of our downstream needs. So it starts with our schema. Now, every structured data set has a schema, and understanding what that schema is the first step to better data governance. Today, the modern data platforms allow for automated inference and capture of the data set schema. So we should not be using manual spreadsheets or Word documents to document our schema. We should let the tooling be the first pass of, here's our schema. And then that tooling will allow us to document the schema in a metadata repository. And, Hive Metastore, Google Data Catalog, Azure Data Catalog, they're all examples of technical metadata catalogs that capture schema. These technical catalogs will often let us augment the technical schema with some business-like descriptions of the data. But usually they're fairly simplistic and they don't allow a lot of extension on top of that. It's really important that we do describe those schemas correctly, because finding the right data set in a large organization is a huge challenge. And schema documentation is kind of the first step to helping us, build the right infrastructure and building blocks on which to do better data management and data governance. And so what's the first thing that all analytics people do when they get a data set and they want to use it to build a model or to build an outcome, a decision? You look at the schema, you understand what schema you're working with, and then you usually start with an exploratory profiling to get a baseline understanding of what's in that schema, what's in that data set. So you'll look at things like cardinality, min-max values, null value. Every analytics person, whether they're doing it, just ad hoc, interactively, or whether they're building a data pipeline to deploy into production, they'll start with some preliminary profiling. The next step is usually to then actually measure the quality of the data against a set of rules. And those rules are important because they provide kind of a framework for what's important in terms of the data. Data, there's all kinds of dimensions that we can measure the data against, such as accuracy, completeness, consistency, uniqueness, timeliness, and validity of the data. And they all matter. And I'll give an example from the Gen AI world. I was reading recently, there's some people were trying to build models to identify different types of cancer. And one of the things that they found was that they had all these pictures of what cancer looks like, but they didn't have pictures of what healthy parts of the body look like without cancer. And so the quality of the data is not just about, is that good data that's describing what cancer looks like, but does it also describe what not cancer looks like? And so that was a a problem in this model with completeness of the model. It didn't have the scope to understand all of the data. And so if I'm just looking at profiling and just kind of, have I got all the right missing values, I may be missing the fact that there's a whole set of data that's actually not there. And so that's why having these data quality dimensions is important, because it allows us to look at the data from all these different facets. Now, we can use automation. We don't have to do all of this manually. So we can use automation and machine learning algorithms against the output of our profiling to identify data anomalies. And so that's a big trend right now in data quality, is to use profiling to do anomaly detection and to look for trends in the data and say, hey, this data isn't following that trend, or it's diverged in some way in this recent load. Maybe that's a problem with the data. And so we can use automation to automate the ability to capture some of these data quality measures. At the same time as we're doing profiling to understand the characteristics of the data, this is a great opportunity to understand sensitivity of the data. And so we can use tooling to actually infer what data elements within our data sets are sensitive and which ones are not. That's really important so that we can understand how to control access to the data, and even which data sets are allowed to be used for different types of processing. Now, all these outputs, from profiling to data quality rules to sensitivity classifications, they're most useful. We can reuse those outputs most easiest if we store them alongside our schema documentation, but in an enterprise data catalog. And an enterprise data catalog is a little bit different from the technical metadata catalog that I talked about earlier. And so let's look at what's different here. So the first thing is, typically a technical data catalog just covers a specific environment. And I'll take the example of the Hive Metastore. At my last organization, we had a large enterprise data lake, and we used the Hive Metastore as our physical catalog, our physical technical catalog, to describe that data. But as soon as we wanted to understand what's in the EDL and the EDW and maybe what's on cloud, now we're looking at different physical catalogs. And so one of the primary tenets of an enterprise data catalog is to provide that single view of the data, where we can look at the data regardless of the physical environment that it's stored in. The other thing that an enterprise data catalog does is it enables descriptions of the data beyond just the physical schema. And so if you think again about the Hive Metastore, it's really concerned with all the physical constructs of the data in the data lake, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining business terms, or even it doesn't do a good job of capturing descriptions of the data, and especially descriptions of the data in business terminology. It doesn't do a good job of relating that data to different domains of ownership. And so enterprise data catalog allows you to kind of take that raw technical metadata and put it into context. And a really important thing to consider is that in the past, often these enterprise data catalogs were kind of a static documentation library. And being static, they would get out of date. As soon as they were done, they would be out of date, right? As soon as you'd enter the information, the next day somebody goes and makes a change in the physical environment, and now they're out of date. And nobody looks at the enterprise data catalog because I'd rather look at the schema and know that it's right. So it's really important that in an enterprise data catalog, you have a live connection of automated capture of schema information so that the content that you have there is always up to date. It won't always be complete with all the descriptions of the data. It won't always have all the extensions that you want, but at least you know that you can look there for data across all your environments, and it's going to be complete and it's going to be up to date. Now, that's really important because the catalog is a big factor in being able to accelerate the use of automation tasks. If I have all the information in one place, that allows me to now build an automation that I wouldn't necessarily be able to do if I had to kind of scrape against a bunch of different sources to understand how to do some automation. Now, the next step in understanding our data and doing a better job of governing it is understanding how did that data set get built? And that's the topic of data lineage. So typically in a large organization, we have hundreds of sources that are used to create data sets and to bring context to the data. So I may have a bunch of transactions, and those transactions, if we think about banking, are typically held across multiple operational systems, but they're describing activities that our customers are involved in. So it's not just the transactional systems that need to feed the data, it's also maybe the MDM that feeds customer data. Maybe you need to understand as part of those transactions, what's the household look like? What's the total lifetime value of the customer? And a whole bunch of other stuff that kind of augment that transactional data. So building these useful data sources or data products, we generally involve many, many different sources of data. So that's a complicated set of steps. And oftentimes we'll create hops of data. Maybe we'll load data into a data environment and have a staging area. Then we'll do some preliminary cleaning of the data. Then maybe we'll combine that data with other lines of business. There's all different types of stages that we go through to build those data sets. I sometimes call those stages hops of data. And so data lineage is the documentation of those data hops, along with all the mappings, the transformations, the fixes that you do to data, the enhancements that you do. Sometimes you'll use like an address validation tool to fix addresses. And so you want to take in the raw address, but then you want to augment that address by using address validation and giving the most correct address. So you need to understand the steps that happen to create that data set. Because when you're looking at the data and maybe there's a problem with the data, you need to know, how did it get there? And if I need to fix something, where do I need to fix it? Is it in this data set, or is it way back 3 steps before that? In a regulated environment, such as financial services, the need for data lineage is mandated for certain data elements. And I'll use the example from my last banking organization. We did a lot of work for transaction monitoring and name screening, and all the data elements involved in that process needed to have complete lineage all the way back to the source, to the consuming processes that were doing that transaction monitoring. And regulators would look at every step along the way. How did I come up with this hop of data? How did I create this data so that I know that it's valid coming from my sources? If I understand what my schema is, how I built that schema, now I need to get a better understanding of how does that schema relate to the business. So when the business are describing their processes, they often use very specific terms that are very line of business specific and not technical to describe their business processes. And how they identify and describe the data within those processes is usually different across lines of business. And that's why capturing business terms and data elements within the context of that line of business is really important. Because when you look back at the technical schema and how that's described, it's going to be named completely differently than how the business typically describes their data. And so we can create this layer of abstraction where we're describing business terms, and those business terms are meaningful to the business. We're describing what data elements they like to collect. And then we can take that content and connect it to the physical schema content in our catalog. And this bridges the gap so that we now have technical data elements over here, data elements that are business describing over here in the middle, and then business terms that at a high level describe what's going on in the business. And depending on your context, you can view the data through the different lenses. And so those business terms and data elements really provide the semantic context to the data that allows everybody to understand it from their own perspective. And one of the benefits of doing that is when you start to understand it from a business point of view, you start to see the redundancy between lines of business, between data sets that were created across different lines of business, where the names were slightly different. But once I have business terms and data elements to tie them together, I can now start to examine and see the redundancies and maybe start to clean up what my data products look like so that I'm providing an easier to consume data assets for all the consumers to use. And then, so who's actually doing this work? I think I mentioned at the beginning that this is a team effort, and it combines different people across technical and business teams. So let's talk about access to data and how that's been done in the past, and how data governance kind of gives us some better toolings. So data is typically owned by the business, but managed by IT teams. So in the past, and I've seen this almost everywhere I worked, IT teams tend to grant access to the data. Because why? Because it's their data set in terms of building that data set and delivering it to the consumers. But they're not the actual owners of the data. So they don't have the context of who should be allowed to use the data and for what purposes it can be used. With data governance, we assign data stewards as the business owners of the data, and they're managing the access of the data. And they can do that because they see the data from their terminology through their data elements, and they can grant access to the data sets in a way that is meaningful to them. It's already been translated for them, so they don't have to rely on the data custodians or the IT owners of the data. And the data stewards actually don't just responsible for managing access to the data, but they're responsible for monitoring and enforcing all the data governance policies. So that would include things like, how do I remediate data quality with the data? What is the right authorized use of sensitive data and all of that? That's where data stewards come in, and that's where they can provide context that the IT people can't necessarily do. On the IT side, what IT custodians can do is provide the infrastructure to enable data governance. So make sure that the schemas are up to date, that they're being fed. Make sure that automation is being used wherever it can be used so that the business owners of the data can do their bit of the work because they have the right context and they have the up-to-date artifacts in place. And so finally, what can you do to help ensure success? I think I mentioned at the beginning that data governance and data management, it doesn't happen overnight. And it can be a many-year process. So you're not going to get to perfection right away. But if you start slowly, start with small increments, make sure those increments provide value at every step along the way. That's the best way to kind of gain buy-in to the process and help the business understand, by doing this, by taking a little bit more time up front, by documenting some things or building an integration, I can actually save you time in your consumption of the data or in your building of new data later on. And that's where automation comes in. Make sure that instead of doing manual processes, try not to use spreadsheets wherever possible. Try to use automation and have automation feed a catalog so that you're able to build on those data management and data governance assets that you're creating. As soon as they're in a spreadsheet, they're not that usable to people, and they're probably going to get out of date really quickly. Data mesh is a concept that can be used to democratize the efforts. In the past, a lot of data governance was very centralized, and I think it's important to have a central set of policies and guidelines, but allow the lines of business to do their own work and allow the IT teams to build out their data products so that those teams can scale at their own speeds, so that people feel empowered to do the work that they're doing. And so data mesh is a great concept and architecture to look into to enable that. And then a data catalog, an enterprise data catalog especially, you can use that as a control plane to manage the data mesh and to, as your kind of central point of lookup for the data. It doesn't matter where the data is. That data catalog is kind of your central control plane for all of that data. And finally, make sure that you explain the benefits of data management and governance to your stakeholders, because people naturally don't like rules, but if they see the benefit that they're getting it out of having those rules and processes, then they're going to buy into the efforts that are needed to do that. And they're going to start to see the payoffs from doing that. So that's the end of my content. Elena, if you want to come back now and we can have a discussion.
This was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It seems to me that governance is key for the success of every AI initiative. And I do understand from your presentation that it is a journey. It's not a one time that, okay, we do this project, a 3 months project, and we'll be done with governance. It's almost like a lifetime commitment from the company and from the enterprise. The good news that I got from your presentation as well is that nowadays we have tooling that to facilitate this implementation. So thank you very much. Now that, so for our viewers, now they can have a better understanding of your experience on the financial services as well as governance, we'll have a quick Q&A, okay? So starting, like you, on your last position, you held the title of VP of Data Enablement and Architecture at one of Canada's major banks. This role is not commonly seen, at least here in Brazil, we haven't seen it yet. So could you walk us through what is this position entails and share some insights on the impact it had on the bank's operation and how this unique position contributes to building a more robust and effective data governance framework? And I do know as well, Steve, that you have a love and hate relationship with data governance. So if you can also mention that, would be great.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So data enablement and architecture, there's no mention of data management and data governance there, and that's on purpose. I think what matters is the outcomes, not necessarily how we got there. And so if we think about the goal, it's to enable the use of data and effective use of the data. And to do that, we need the right architecture, we need the right infrastructure. And so my team was primarily focused on building up our capabilities so that we could capture the right metadata through automation. And then not just having that metadata, but using it to make things faster and easier. And so a good example of that from my last role was we had our analytics users who were new to the cloud platform, and they were trying to use the cloud in order to use the tooling for analytics. and they were hoping to get an acceleration. But what they found was, now, I used to have all my environment maybe in the EDL and everything was all set up. But now I've got these new environments that I need to set up and new tools. And they were finding that it was taking about 3 weeks to set up each environment. So every time they had a use of data or data initiative, as we called them, it would take about 3 weeks to set up the data that they needed and all the toolings. And so we looked at that problem and we said, hey, we've got a bunch of metadata already in the catalog. Let's use that metadata to accelerate this activity. And so we could already have them go into a form and fill out a form and say, first of all, find the data they needed and say, this is the data I need. This is why I need to use that data. And here's the type of pattern that I'm going to be doing. And the patterns were things like, I'm going to create a bunch of reports, or I'm going to do some interactive analytics, or I'm going to create an operational use case. Every one of those patterns required different tooling on the cloud. And so if I know what data I need, what types of activities I'm going to be doing the data, and what my use cases are, I can now automate the creation of those environments. And so we were able to collect all of that information in a quick form that took about 20 minutes for the data analytics people to fill out. And then immediately they would save that form into the catalog, and that would fire off some automation that would spin up the environments. So then they could just have that environment right away, that, within the hour sort of thing. So the environment would get spun
That's
out.
amazing.
They would already have the data set sitting there waiting for them to consume. And the right people were involved in granting access to the data, because we were able to use automation to fire off, a task for somebody on the business side to grant access to the data. We didn't need to involve IT because the business owners understood the context of the data because it was properly documented. So everything from 3 weeks of manual process where they had to figure out, how do I now create this environment? How do I load the data into it? Everything was automated. And that's the power
Amazing.
of good data management and good data governance.
That is amazing. From 2 weeks to 1 hour. That's really, really, really good. So we've known each other for a long time, and I know that you've been working on the data and financial sector for years. So if we talk a little bit of the AI landscape, and that is evolving really rapidly, and data is core of AI. This is something that I really believe. I know you believe it as well. So based on your experience, how did you ensure that the data governance practices kept pace with the rapidly evolving AI technologies used in the financial sector?
Yeah, so really it's looking at where are the heavy lifting efforts in data management and data governance, and how can we use AI to accelerate those and do it differently than we had in the past. So the one example I gave previously was using anomaly detection with profiling. Another one that was more Gen AI related was, we looked at all of the policies around data security and around the use of data and the use of infrastructure. And those policies would often require the IT teams to go through these really lengthy approval processes. But the biggest problem in going through those approvals was understanding the policies. And so by putting some of those policies into a model, into an LLM, we were able to make it easier for the IT practitioners to better understand what those policies are, and to kind of come up with the guidance so that they were making the right steps to getting those approvals. And, that was kind of I don't think we fully refined that yet because it was hard to find all the policies. And one of the things we found from that is, you know what, the sources of documentation for that data weren't well understood or well known. And oftentimes rules were in the minds of the people who were enforcing those. And that allowed us to see that, hey, if we can get those rules into the right places centrally, we can then leverage an LLM to actually make it easier to understand those rules and make it faster so that, again, you're just democratizing the understanding, right? So if you understand what those security postures and policies are, everybody can do the work to actually get the approvals faster. And that means that infrastructure is available earlier and easier, right? And so if you take that concept and apply it to everywhere, it's very powerful.
Amazing. So staying ahead of time, right? Staying ahead of the curve is crucial. So if we change gears a little bit, Canada financial sector, as well as in the entire world, it is like highly regulated. And we talk a lot about data sensitivity. How did you approach the automated discovery and classification of sensitive data?
So I think, you know, if you go back a few years and even with most data lakes, not just data warehouses, people were doing that manually, where they would flag what attributes were sensitive and what were not. Sometimes it wasn't being done at all. As an example, we had a very large EDL with 30 million attributes, and there was no sensitivity classification on any of it. And it was a big problem for understanding, making sure that the access was controlled properly. So one of the things that we started to do was look at what are the right toolings that can do some automation to generate the sensitivity. And we looked at a bunch of different tools, Google DLP, Azure Purview, Big ID. There's a bunch of toolings. Informatica has one as well. A lot of those toolings are regex based, and you have to specify a bunch of regex rules to make them work. Some of them are starting to use machine learning and AI to detect. But what we found was no single tool does a good job on its own. And so we would take the outputs of different tools depending on where the data is being sourced from. We would send that to the enterprise data catalog, and then that would allow curation of those results. So that way we have, you know, an 80 to 90% starting point, and then people can go in and override that on the enterprise data catalog. And so regardless of what tool actually fed the detection of sensitivity or not, we could then override that, and everybody had access to that. And then when access was being granted to the data, it was already in the catalog, the understanding of that access, and it could automatically be considered as part of granting access. And so again, it's like you have these tools that feed the content, you put them into the catalog, and you use the catalog to then be your control plane for how you access.
That's nice. And it seems like you mentioned there in the terminology, the terms, the business terms and all of that. And this communication between what do you have and what we bring from the catalog, the technical catalog, and what are the business definitions, this is like one of the biggest challenges that has always exists, like since I started my career a long time ago. So I'm curious about your practical approach. So the concept of starting small and I'm sorry here. So the bridging the gap between technical and business language. How did you see this approach improve communication and data utilization between the different departments?
Yeah, so the way we approach it, and I think it's effective, is kind of starting with the bottom up. So ingesting that technical catalog into a central place, but then allowing the business to start to define their own terminology and not kind of tied necessarily at that point to the technical assets. First, because there's so many, but second, because they may not understand those. But over time, as you build up a set of business terms and data elements that matter to the business, and you've already got these technical assets over here from the technical catalog, you can start to build the bridges there in the metadata and start to say, hey, this data element that I've identified from a business point of view, that's actually, as I'm sourcing my data, I see that, that actually corresponds to these technical data assets. And so you can create the links in that metadata catalog that allow you to link together the business terms with the technical terms. And what we found was that was helpful not just from the business understanding the data, it also helped the technical teams, because oftentimes you're new to the team. There's, the old team who built the data asset in the first place is no longer there. Once that connection is made between the business side and the technical side, now I've got even better context for my technical teams to understand the data. And they can start to see, hold on, like we're calling this one thing, but I am actually seeing where it's coming from. It's something else. And I can start to do stuff to fix my data. And so it really it helps from both sides.
Yeah. Communication is key, right? And it is amazing, like how that facilitates it for both teams, as you said, business and technical. So I'm curious about your practical approach. So the concept of starting small with data governance is often recommended. Can you share one of your success story of a small scale project that led to significant improvements in the overall data governance strategy?
Okay. I think I would go back to the creation of the data initiative and the collection of metadata around that, and how that kind of provided the foundation of how to accelerate all of our data analytics work. And so I think the key there is you don't want to make, consumers of the data don't care about data governance, but what they care about is making their work faster. And so being able to speed up their ability to, do this data work. I think there was a measure that we had where the typical analytics lifecycle would take about 6 weeks. I mean, some of them were just hours or days, but the typical cycle for a productionized model was around 6 weeks. And they were always looking for, we've always got our backlog of work is too much. And we don't want more process. We want faster access to data and faster use of data. And so what was really powerful for the teams was being able to close that loop and do more analytics in a shorter time frame. So taking it initially from 6 weeks to 4 weeks, that was the goal. But then after that, how can we accelerate their use of the data so that it's 3 weeks instead? Because if you think about a lot of analytics work is just getting the data and massaging it so that it's useful. If we can do enough of that up front, and that's just what good data management is, their starting point becomes now the interesting part for analytics, as opposed to now I've got to do a bunch of data engineering. And data management and data governance enables the reuse of that data engineering so that you're not doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah, that is like a great example, right, of how small steps, and then you go like from 4 weeks to 3, 6 weeks to 4 weeks to 3 to 2, and sometimes even to 1 week, and always bringing the result, right, for your internal client to be able to do their work instead of preparing the data, bringing the knowledge of the data so they can really work. For our final question, I'd like to look at the future. Based on your experience, Steve, and your view of current trends, what do you see as the next frontier in data governance for the financial institutions, particularly in relation to the emerging AI technologies and evolving regulatory landscapes?
Yeah. I think the future goes back to the same theme of making data management and data governance invisible or kind of behind the scenes. When you're using ChatGPT, you're trying to do the same work, but you're just trying to make it easier, right? And I think the future is more and more AI will allow us to hide a lot of the effort that's behind data management. But by capturing it in the right place and storing it centrally and using the tooling correctly, I think we can make like the visibility of data management go away, but the benefits become more apparent. And so I like to think of, because I'm not a huge fan of data governance, I like to think people are not going to be as consumed by data governance because it's just going to be there embedded in everything already. And it's going to be relatively invisible, and the values will be apparent as opposed to the efforts involved in it.
I think that's amazing. I think I told you before that lots of my clients, and I'm sure yours too, like they see governance as bureaucracy. And one of your slides says it is not that. The objective of governance is this: facilitate, accelerate, and keep secure, right? And keep with quality and evolve every time. It is not the desire to just bring trouble for our internal clients. So this is amazing, Steve. Thank you so much for your insights. I know you'll be starting a new challenge pretty soon, so I wish you all the best, and I'm so sure it's going to be a huge success. And please, for our viewers and listeners, if you really enjoyed this conversation, all this discussion, you can please send your questions after to our channel. And don't forget to subscribe and join us in the next time as we continue to explore the data environment. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.